On this episode of Newt's World, Gallup's Economic Confidence Index registered negative 34 in May, reflecting further deterioration in how Americans assess the economy's current state. And according to the Pew Research Center, the number one issue in their recent June poll is inflation, with the cost of groceries and gas a top concern for many Americans. In a recent survey by Redfin, 91% of 18 to 27-year-olds, also known as Gen Z, consider housing affordability a crucial factor in choosing the next president. Only 26% of Gen Z own homes because housing prices have surged 40% since the pandemic. And in job news, the U.S. labor market added 272,000 jobs in May, marking an acceleration in the pace of hiring. Here to talk about the current state of the economy, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Dr. Vance Ginn. He is the former Chief Economist for the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, the founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting, and the host of Let People Prosper podcast. Vance, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, Speaker, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I've been a fan of your work and your podcast now for many years, and so it's really a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Well, it's an interesting time. Why don't we start with, because you're a professional and you've looked at this a good while, how do you assess the current state of inflation in America?
Well, as you highlighted there with some of the surveys that are going on and just the economic data, I think that we have high inflation, elevated inflation, and this is a weak economy. We see a lot of the headlines show that this is a strong economy. The Biden administration's coming out saying this is such a strong economy. But when you ask normal people, Americans, everyday Americans, that's not what they're showing. In fact, a recent poll showed 48% of Americans think we're in a recession. And that's not indicative of declining consecutive quarters of real GDP or anything like that, but it tells you where people are at. And I think a lot of this is driven by the inflation. The latest CPI inflation numbers showed 3.3% increase year over year. If you exclude food and energy, which of course we all buy, but they're more volatile, so they like to exclude it in the core CPI, that was up 3.4%. So those have moderated, Speaker, but from 9% a couple years ago, but it's still up 3.5%, which is well above the 2% target that the Federal Reserve would like for it to have. And whenever inflation has been soaring over the last couple of years, people's wages, their earnings just haven't been able to keep up. In fact, average weekly earnings are down, adjusted for inflation, by 4% since January of 2021 when Biden took office. So that is the real reason why I think so many people feel underwater, is because they just can't keep up with this high inflation from the excessive government spending by Congress, the overregulation by Biden, and too much money printing by the Fed. This is just a bad scenario.
It reminds me of Jimmy Carter, who actually had worse inflation. And at one point, the joke was that I didn't realize that by the time I became a millionaire, that would buy one Big Mac. People say to me, they're working hard, but they're not getting ahead. A friend of mine said that they knew a couple with 4 children, both parents work, and they recently had shifted from Jiffy peanut butter to the store label peanut butter because they just couldn't afford the name brands anymore. And Clifton and I have noticed when we go shopping, the number of places, particularly say cereal, where you either now get a smaller box for the same price or the original box at a lot higher price. But you just see the impact. And I've been telling people that the great challenge for Biden is that every time people go to the grocery store, it undoes all of his advertising.
Yeah.
It's the real world. One of the things which is emerging, which I think is interesting, is a strain in the housing market and a transition towards a lot more apartment dwelling. What's your take on that?
It's quite fascinating. I think it goes to this housing affordability issue that we're talking about here with inflation and higher interest rates. And then one thing I did want to mention about going back to Jimmy Carter is that Larry Summers, more progressive, but he's been more sane from the left than a lot of other economists that are out there recently. He did some numbers recently that said if you include interest rates in the inflationary picture, which we should, and we used to back in the 70s and 80s, the inflation rate would be closer to 10 or 11%. Because interest rates have soared so fast over the last few years. So we're not getting a good picture of what's going on with inflation. And that's hurting the housing market. People can't keep up with inflation, but also when interest rates went from 3%, where I locked in a couple of years ago, actually 2.8%, and now you're having to get a mortgage rate for 7%. Speaker, I may not be able to afford my house today, given how much I'd have to pay.
When you start talking about a 7% rate on a 30-year mortgage, that really adds up to a remarkable difference in your total payments.
Exactly. Your monthly payments would essentially double from what you're paying today. And so that's pushing people a lot more into the rental market when they can't afford those higher priced homes, higher interest rate, and the inflation that's all around them. And so that's pushing them more into the rental market.
It seems to me that some of the regulations have also raised the cost of everything. In fact, trucking are things that affect producing lumber. There are a lot of ways in which government has made housing a more difficult market.
It's also a lot of local regulations. Lot sizes, they'll limit the lot size and they'll make it pretty high. And then that reduces the amount of housing that can go on, how much you can build up. For example, I live in Round Rock, Texas, which is just north of Austin, Texas. And there's a lot of sprawl that's going on and people are leaving Austin because it's so expensive, plus a lot of progressive. We call it the People's Republic of Austin. But it's very expensive in Austin. And a lot of that has to do with local zoning regulations. And so that's also contributing to higher prices that we've got to do something about as well.
Yeah, we had an experience in 1996. I'd been doing a lot of work with Habitat for Humanity. And when the Republican convention was in San Diego, we thought, well, why don't we build a house for a poor family and bring the Habitat tradition? The fees to be allowed to build a house were larger than the total cost of that house in Georgia. It was a startling example of how local regulations and local fees can create housing crises without regard to the feds. The other area that I spend a lot of time on is healthcare. And it seems like there's almost an endless engine of raising costs in the health area. Partly the baby boomers are getting older. They're using more medical things. Partly we have a problem of obesity that's almost entirely self-induced. But the net effect is health costs keep going up, and it's already almost a fifth of the economy. What is your take on what has to be done to get to a more affordable and more effective health system?
There's a lot of moving parts to this, as you just mentioned, on the demand side and the supply side. And I'm an economist, so I love talking about supply and demand. But whenever you have the restraints on the supply side with doctors and nurse practitioners, and there's a lot of occupational licensing that goes on that restricts the number of them. And you also have the restrictions on the number of new hospitals that can be built from zoning, some of the things we just mentioned. And then on the demand side, you have all these subsidies, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, there's local programs as well. And some of those may need to exist for a certain group of the population, but I just think it's overly saturated with subsidies. And so therefore, you don't have a well-functioning market system. We don't have market prices. We have government set prices. We have reimbursement rates that are determined well before we go to the doctor of how much those amounts are. For example, you might pay your copay of $20, but the fee on the backside may have been $1,000 that we don't see. And so that doesn't allow us to efficiently allocate the resources, in economic terms, but be able to go where it's going to be the best quality at the cheapest price in the healthcare sector. And I think we need to get back to patients paying directly the doctor so we can have a better connection there. There's a lot of this going on with direct primary care across much of the country, which I think is a good step in the right direction for a better market system. But the healthcare system is not just going to go away because, as you mentioned, baby boomers are retiring. They're getting older. They're going to have more doctor visits and everything else. And at the same time, we have a fewer number of people that are being born. The fertility rate is not as high as what it once was. And so we have fewer people paying into the system. And that's also contributing to problems for Medicare and Social Security and even Medicaid. I think going back to some key reforms, as you were part of in 1996, and thinking about what happened with the states, with Utah, some other states that are really showing a lot of reforms across this. And I'm a big fan, as you are, of federalism. I work with a lot of states across the country. I think going back to block grants and getting off of the federal dependency and have fewer ties and red tape will be so important to bring down the cost of healthcare and the cost of taxpayers across the country.
I'd say two things. One, the more we can allow the states to innovate with things like Medicaid, the better health outcomes and the better cost outcomes. And two, one of the biggest things we did, in addition to balancing the budget for 4 straight years, is we created Medicare Advantage, which has turned out to be wildly popular. We actually passed a major Medicare reform during the 1996 presidential campaign. And we did it so carefully that AARP sided with us against the Clinton White House. Because Medicare Advantage gave better care at lower cost, it was one of the keys to being able to move towards a balanced budget. But let me jump to the big issue. When I was younger and you thought inflation, then you looked at the Federal Reserve. And this Federal Reserve, I think, has had a whole bunch of problems. They inherited, first from Trump and then compounded dramatically by Biden, a huge amount of spending, which was in part designed to offset the costs of the COVID pandemic. It seems to me that the demand side model, which says we're going to slow down the economy to a point where by reducing demand for goods and services, we will shrink the inflation rate just because there'll be fewer people doing fewer things and they won't keep the pressure on. The problem with that demand side approach is if you're the Federal Reserve, it essentially, by raising interest rates, is aimed at business and individuals. But if the government is increasing spending by $1 trillion or more a year, then the government's providing all the liquidity that the Fed's trying to take out, and you actually increase the bias towards government and against the private sector by that kind of a model. I mean, am I missing something here?
No, I don't think you're missing something. I think the way that I like to explain it, I'd love to get your thoughts on this maybe, is Congress overspends. They run these massive deficits. We're running trillion plus deficits now. Net interest on the debt is $1 trillion, which is more than we're spending on national defense of about $860 billion. And Speaker, back whenever I was the chief economist for OMB and worked at the Russ Vought and others there at OMB, in the president's last budget, President Trump's last budget, we found $4.6 trillion in savings over a decade, by just small tweaks here and there because of the massive budget, as you know, that we have at the federal level. And of course, then COVID hit and all that got thrown out the window. But there was a push to really start to restrain government spending. I'm hopeful that that will be the case if there is, or when there is a second Trump term, that spending will be an issue. That's my big thing, is sustainable budgeting. We haven't had that for a long time. And so this contributes to increases in deficits and debt, which the Fed then uses as ammunition to increase their balance sheet. They buy Treasury securities off of the private market that increases their balance sheet, puts more money into the economy. And now you have a situation of too much money chasing too few goods, the classic definition of inflation. And so to me, it's not that Congress creates inflation, it's the Fed, but Congress gives the Fed the ammunition to create that inflation by printing more money and putting it into the economy. At the same time, because that other part of that saying, too much money chasing too few goods is contributed to by the excess government spending, the handouts that were given to where people didn't want to work, so labor supply decreased. We're down now to 62.5% in the labor force participation rate, which is contributing to more inflationary pressure out there. And then Biden coming in and over-regulating the economy. At this point through Trump's term, there was actually a cut in the final cost of rules under regulations. Under Biden, we're looking at about $1.6 trillion in increases in debt, according to the American Action Forum of Douglas Holtz-Eakin over there. And this is a massive cost that is not reflective of the taxes that have been increased, but they're essentially taxes that are restraining the supply. At the same time, demand and the money supply is increasing. And that's why we've had persistent inflation. I was not one of those who said this was going to be transitory inflation. I really saw this early on, that there was too much spending in 2020 and we had lockdowns. And then that was put on steroids by Biden and the Fed. And I think the Fed is well behind the curve. Their balance sheet, Speaker, is still $7.2 trillion when it was $4 trillion before the pandemic. So it's coming down from the $9 trillion it was before, and this is the Fed's balance sheet, but it's still way too high. And so I think that we're going to see more inflation, especially whenever the Fed's going to have a tough time cutting interest rates, whenever Congress is running such massive deficits.
The Fed, in that sense, is in a tremendous box. This is exactly what happened all through the 60s and 70s. Is the Fed would raise interest rates the economy would go into a recession. The Fed would lower interest rates to get the economy growing again. Then you'd have inflation, so the Fed would raise interest rates. And it was a mess. But at the same time, I have been surprised at the continuing ability of the economy to grow and to have employment. You would have thought with the effort of the Fed that you'd have had a much bigger drop in employment. And I don't know how much of that's been because federal spending has offset the impact of interest rates. When you look at the May job report and you look at what's happening in the economy, how do you interpret it?
You look at some of the headlines, they look good. 272,000 jobs were added. 230,000 jobs were in the private sector, which means about 40,000 jobs were added in the government sector. And that's one thing that's been concerning to me. And you highlighted this in the opening remarks, that government jobs have increased by nearly 3% year over year, whereas private sector jobs are up only 1.6%. I want to let people prosper, so I want people to have jobs, but we got to remember that the government doesn't have any money. Every one of those jobs has to be paid for by someone in the private sector. So if government employment is growing twice as fast as the private sector employment, we've got a problem, even more so than we had before, because that's less money that's going to productive activity throughout the economy. You look at the unemployment rate, it shows 4%. Well, 4% has increased from 3.4% just a few months ago. And that sort of an increase of 0.6 percentage points, the research shows that when you have a half percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, you're typically in a recession. The unemployment rate in the labor market is always a lagging indicator of what's happening in the overall economy. And when you look at the household employment, so there's two surveys, right? The establishment survey that's done for non-farm employment, that's the one that shows 272,000 jobs. And there were revised downwards of 15,000, which we've seen that a lot over the last couple of years. But there was revised down for the last 2 months by 15,000. But if you look at the household survey that's done by households, that one has only increased by 300,000 jobs over the last year compared to the 2.3 million jobs reported by the establishment survey. And we've seen this divergence now for 2 years. And I think what's going on here is that we have jobs that are being added and reported by establishments, meaning firms, and the non-farm job report. But when you look at the household employment, people just say they have one job. It's because they're working multiple jobs to keep up with the inflation. Part-time employment is up about 600,000. Full-time employment is down 200,000 over the last year. So we have fewer full-time people working. So this is not indicative of a vibrant or a strong labor market, even though some of these numbers on the top line look good. And the other key thing that I look at here, Speaker, is the average weekly earnings or average hourly earnings. You adjust those for inflation, and average weekly earnings are down 3.9% since January of 2021. They've been coming up here a little bit more recently, but they're still down. And this is a compounding effect that's really hurting Americans across the country. So yes, I see some strengths on the top, but if you dig underneath the hood, there's still a lot of weakness going on in the labor market.
When you read or watch Secretary of the Treasury Yellen, do you think she's in touch with the real world?
No.
It's weird to watch her. It's kind of hard to believe that she's been as important as she has been and had some positions which are quite impressive. But maybe she's a little bit like Biden and she's missing a step or something. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe so. Janet Yellen's got to talk things up. I mean, they're going into an election year, or we're in election year. The election's coming up quickly. They've got to talk up this economy any way they can, because the polls are not showing what I think they want them to, or of course they want them to, right? Is they want these polls to show much more improvement from people's perception of this economy, and they're just not getting it. They're throwing all this money, all this industrial policy, all the green energy agenda. I mean, they're crowding out the private market with all this nonsense, and it's creating economic strife for millions of people across the country. And this is another reason why I just don't think that industrial policy works, especially the way they're going at it. I would rather see us be cutting taxes, cutting government spending, cutting regulation. To me, that's industrial policy, because you're unleashing the economic potential of the entrepreneur throughout the economy, instead of trying to put your thumb, being government putting the thumb on the scale of which direction we should go. Green energy is a farce. I want an all of the above approach for green energy. Don't get me wrong. I think we need a lot more nuclear, to be honest with you, but we don't need government picking winners and losers throughout the marketplace, because we're going to see bad outcomes just like we do in China and Russia.
I think the election results in Europe last week were an indication of people repudiating very, very expensive fantasies that were propagated by the Greens, who suffered real losses in the election. You've made a significant case about reforming the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. What drew you into this, and why do you think it's necessary to reform FDIC?
Yeah, it's something that's drawn more of my attention here for a while. And a lot of it actually grew during the Biden administration because of all the woke nonsense that they've got going on at these institutions, whether it be the FDIC or FOMC at the Fed. They're looking at all these different things. They're using a lot of ESG kind of nonsense to go into investing and forcing businesses to have some sort of ESG investment strategy when those returns on those investments have not been the same as even the S&P 500, just a general broad market indices. And so they're pushing more of this throughout the economy through their financial regulations, particularly at the FDIC and other places. And the chair, Martin Gruenberg, recently they found a toxic culture, sexual misconduct going on there, a lot of other things that are happening at the FDIC that I think are reflective of not only their toxic culture, which they need to clean house, but the over financial regulations across the economy. And so going back to housing earlier, it's difficult for a lot of people nowadays with low income, low credit scores to get access to credit because of these bad government policies by the FDIC and others. And so whenever you're thinking about the overregulation of the economy, a lot of this is in the financial sector, which of course trickles down, if you will, throughout the rest of the economy and makes it very costly for us to continue to have investment, savings, grow the economy as a whole. And so I really think we need some key reforms that starts to rein back the regulations that are done by the FDIC and these other alphabet soup of financial regulators, and also clean house of this ESG nonsense and the toxic culture that's going on.
I was with President Trump when he spoke with the Business Roundtable, and about 75 of the leading CEOs in the country, representing corporations that are billions and billions of dollars in assets, they seem to feel that regulations were actually a bigger threat than taxes, that the regulatory state crippled them more, made it harder to do business, made it harder to adapt, and that they really were very responsive to what Trump had tried to do in rolling back regulations, and they really were looking for that kind of commitment for 2025. I just found it fascinating. I think it may require us to do a combined analysis of taxes and regulations rather than do either one in isolation.
Some people say that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act didn't pay for itself, and there's some discussion about all that going on. But whenever I was at OMB, I was Chief Economist there. I had 10 PhD economists, and we had these macro models and everything that we would do. And we were looking into that, what's happened over the first couple of years. Because I was there from June 2019 to May of 2020, where I needed to go back to my family during COVID and some health issues with some of my family members and everything. But whenever we looked at this analysis, the tax cuts, you'll have some reduction temporarily in the tax revenue. You're cutting taxes, okay? But it incentivizes more economic activity. And so that brought in more revenue over time. But the deregulation, the combination of those, which you just rightly pointed out, also brought in more revenue because you had more economic growth. And so we showed that within the first 2 years, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut had paid for itself, if you will, from the Trump administration's policies of tax cuts and deregulation that really brought in more growth. And we're continuing to see record revenues today. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And just like then and just like today. So I think you're exactly right. We've got to look at the deregulation side. And one thing, too, that we missed, Speaker, in our analysis that I started bringing forth at OMB was whenever you cut taxes and cut regulations, you also reduce the number of people who are on government programs. So it also reduces spending. We don't need to continue to increase spending. The only reason why we ran deficits was because Congress couldn't control spending. And Trump could have done a better job. I get some of that too. But it was overspending that happened because when you start having more economic growth, you don't have as many people on all these government programs, which you saw during the 90s. That was the way that we were able to rein in government spending then. So we could do this again by having a holistic approach. And I think he also was right to talk, he being President Trump, to talk about cutting the corporate income tax to 15%. That was initially what the Trump administration wanted to do, but in order to get the votes, it went up to 21%. I think that's another big approach. My ideal corporate tax rate is 0 because businesses don't pay taxes, we do. The form of higher prices, lower wages, lower shareholder value, and things of that nature. So cutting that more and more will allow us to be more competitive with many other countries across the globe.
How do you think the state of the economy will factor into the election?
I think it's the number one thing. No matter how much that the Biden administration will try to downplay it and bring up how it's the best economy in the world or whatever they want to say, it's going to play on the minds of voters. And it already is. It's the number one thing on their mind. I think also next year, 2025 is also a very big year in the sense of a fiscal cliffs that are coming up. We have a lot of the Trump tax cuts. The individual marginal tax rates are set to expire. Those cuts are set to expire. So they're all going to go up, which also goes against his statement of not allowing for tax hikes to come on those earning less than $400,000. It reminds me of George H.W. Bush, read my lips, no new taxes, is that he is raising taxes on those people. This is a big issue that I think Trump is going to be rightly on board with, to say, look, we've got to extend these Trump tax cuts. Yes, maybe we need some reforms here and there on certain things, but they can't expire or we're going to have an even worse economic situation. And so I think that maybe is part of this discussion about what do you do with tips and everything else. And just the progressive philosophy of regulating the economy, taxing the economy, redistribution is failing right now, not only in America, but across the globe, like it always does. But we're seeing this on steroids right now, and we need a different approach that starts to tout free market capitalism. And in getting back to how that is the best path to prosperity, it oftentimes gets a bad rap. People want to talk about income inequality and everything. But for me and my research is that the things that cause income inequality are more government, because it holds down those at the bottom through higher minimum wages, occupational licenses, higher taxes, and it forces more money at the top through increases in the money supply. And where does that money go first? It goes to those with a lot of credit and a lot of income, and assets go up first. Housing prices go up. They gain a lot more in wealth, and the ones at the bottom don't benefit from that. And so I think we need to turn the whole tide, Speaker, on saying, look, progressive policies are failing. We need more of our conservative policies moving forward.
I think you've got it exactly right. And I think if you focus on economic growth and you focus on people having a bigger pie, then it's remarkable what you can get done. And it's remarkable how well it can work for everybody. And I think in that sense, the work you're doing is really, really important. It's fascinating to me how this whole process has been operating and how much Biden is almost a test case. If you take Biden and Carter, they are test cases for how politicians who don't know what they're doing can screw up everything. It's just amazing. Vance, I want to thank you for joining me. This has been really informative. I want to mention that you do have a podcast called Let People Prosper, which our listeners can find at vanceginn.com or on Apple Podcasts. But it's been great having you.
Well, thank you so much, Speaker. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. I'm going to keep fighting for a lot of things that you have fought for many years. And I really appreciate what you did during the 90s, and we need more of that again. So thank you again for having me on the program.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Vance Ginn. You can get a link to his podcast, Let People Prosper, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.